Hello and welcome to a high-flying episode of Mysteries of Science. My name's Dan and I'm the editor of Science and Nature, a monthly magazine from the team behind The Week Junior.
And I'm Kieran, the features editor. In each issue of Science and Nature, we explore the universe through our in-depth features and news stories, inspiring images, interviews with top experts, and much more.
This is Mysteries of Science, the podcast where we look at the stories that are unexplainable and the ones that have left scientists scratching their heads for decades. We've already looked at the Loch Ness Monster, extraterrestrial life, and the curse of King Tut's tomb. In this episode, we're looking at something a little bit different.
Some of you will know the story of Amelia Earhart already. They called her the Queen of the Skies. She was a record-breaking pioneer of flying, an inspirational explorer, famous all around the world. But at the height of her fame, Amelia Earhart vanished into thin air and was never heard of again.
In this episode, we're on the trail of a cold case, a mystery that has never been solved. Will we discover what happened to Amelia Earhart?
We're going to be joined by some truly brilliant guests, a modern-day explorer, one of the Science Museum's expert curators, and the author of a best-selling book series about history's most fascinating people.
Yes. Fasten your seatbelts, put your seats in the upright position, and prepare for takeoff. This is Mysteries of Science.
A lot of our Mysteries of Science start with a big question. Are we alone in the universe? Is magic real? Could a monster have survived since the age of the dinosaurs? This one is a little bit different though. This one starts with a person.
Amelia Earhart was born in Kansas on the 24th of July 1897. This was a time of new beginnings in the US, and it really only just come out of that period that we know as the Wild West and was beginning to resemble the country that we recognise today. Almost straight away, Amelia made a name for herself as an adventurer, and her first flight, that's in inverted commas listeners, took place in 1904. She was just 7 and she made a ramp and she attached it to the roof of her parents' tool shed, and then she took a wooden box to the top and whizzed down this ramp. And it wasn't really her most successful airborne stunt, but she told her sister it felt just like flying.
Now, Dan, I'm not a fan of flying, I have to say. I hate getting on a plane, even just for a few hours, so I can't really relate to this. But Amelia loved flying. She had a few different jobs in her early life, but it was always obvious that the skies were calling her.
She was nearly 20 years old when she went to see an air show, and she was just fascinated by seeing airplanes for the first time in her life.
That's Isabel, who writes the much-loved Little People, Big Dreams books.
And she was just fascinated by seeing airplanes for the first time in her life. And then a bit later, there was this pilot called Frank Hawks, and he gave her a ride in a biplane. And from that moment on, she just fell in love with it, you know. So she took lessons and bought her first airplane just 6 months later.
The sky was the limit for Amelia, who was only the 16th woman in the US to be given a pilot's license. Before long, she was breaking and setting flight records left, right, and centre.
Well, her first big achievement was flying up to 4,000 feet, which was something no other female pilot had done before. And then she was also the first woman to fly over the Atlantic. But the first time she did it with a mechanic and a pilot. And then later, she repeated all by herself.
I mentioned earlier that those first decades of the 20th century were an exciting time in the US, but they were also an exciting time for women too. Many of the laws that had previously treated women unfairly were being changed, and women had now more chances to do jobs they wanted to do, for example. Here's Kari Herbert, an explorer and author of We Are Explorers, Extraordinary Women Who Discovered the World.
Well, I think actually it was an incredibly exciting time for women who had the courage and the vision really to go and do something different. There were more opportunities. People were starting to take women slightly more seriously. And there were quite a few women who were so determined to make their mark on the world. And there was actually, for the first time probably in history, there was really an opportunity for them to really push themselves and actually achieve what they wanted to achieve. So for aviation pioneers, the aviatrix, as we call them, around the 1930s, this was an incredibly exciting time of women actually saying, no, this isn't just it was a very male-dominated sort of sport, if you like, or way of exploring the world. But there were women who were really suddenly able to say, no, I can do this too. And they really proved that they could and did some incredible journeys.
There's this incredible feeling in the 1930s for lots of people of being able to go further, faster, higher than ever before. And pilots like Amelia were right at the centre of that.
Yes, it was such an exciting time with new technologies being developed all the time and women finding this newfound confidence and able to really represent themselves for the first time in history, really. And so there was this opportunity of literally opening their wings and taking flight in every sense of the word, which is so exciting.
Today, we know where Amelia's flying is going to end up with her disappearance. But Amelia herself always knew that there was a possibility of disaster during any of her flights. Remember, planes were really, really brand new technology in the 1920s and 30s. New technology wasn't always the most reliable, and so flying at that time was a very dangerous pursuit.
Yeah, no, it was really a case of, you take off and you, hand on heart, don't know if you're going to land where you're hoping to, or if you're going to come out of, the other side of your journey. And I think that really marks a pioneering journey.
Kari's not the only one to point out the risks attached to flying. Here's Heather Bennett, who's an assistant curator at the Science Museum in London.
Well, there was a lot that could go wrong, a lot more than nowadays. Now we have over 100 years experience of aeroplanes and flight technology. Aeroplanes were only invented in the early 1900s, so at that time it was really a sort of 30-year-old technology and one that had come on a really long way in those 30 years. Well, the very earliest planes would have been made of wood, but around 1915 it became possible to make planes from metal, mainly aluminium. This was a lot lighter, stronger and more hard-wearing than wood, so quite desirable change in materials for aircraft there.
Meanwhile, Amelia is flying high. She's become one of the best pilots of her time. As Isabel mentioned earlier, she crossed the Atlantic Ocean on a solo flight in 1928, and that was the achievement that made her a celebrity. And this incredible crossing also earned her a nickname that would stick with her, the Queen of the Air.
Cool. When she was on the ground, Amelia spent her time campaigning for more acceptance for female pilots. At the time, many flying schools still only accepted male students, but the air was calling out to her and she continued to fly, and she entered competitions, becoming the first woman to fly solo across the North American continent and back. And she also competed in loads of smaller, shorter races as well. What was next for this record-breaking flyer?
By 1936, she was already planning a round-the-world flight, crossing 29,000 miles, which was the longest distance ever attempted.
It's the big one, a flight all the way around the world. To survive such a journey at that time, Amelia needed to do a lot of planning. Here's why.
Amelia Earhart's plane was the Lockheed Electra Model 10, and that could travel at top speeds of around 190 miles per hour. Planes could only carry so much fuel, so could only get so far on one tank of fuel. Any long journeys would have to be pre-planned, split up into sections with regular refueling points. If you're going for a distance record, as Amelia Earhart was trying to get around the world, you would kind of have to calculate, how far do I want to push myself in one leg, but still gives me a little bit of wiggle room, in case if I have to fly into a headwind, that's going to expend a bit more fuel than it would if I'm flying with the wind. So it was really a sort of balancing act between giving yourself a safe margin and still sort of trying to push yourself. But it did happen that people push themselves too far and end up in dangerous situations, and things did go wrong.
Amelia knew only too well how quickly things could go wrong. She actually began her round-the-world effort on the 17th of March in 1937, and she had a crew of 4 others. That was 2 navigators and a technical advisor, as well as herself. And she flew from the western US state of California to the islands of Hawaii across the ocean. And all went well till they began to start the next leg of their journey, which was the big trip across the Pacific to Howland Island, where they could refuel. During the run-up to takeoff, the plane's landing gear collapsed, both propellers crashed into the ground, and the plane went skidding on its belly. The flight obviously was off. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but they just had to wait for the plane to be repaired.
This accident shouldn't have affected Amelia's round-the-world attempts beyond delaying it by a few days. The plane was repaired, and as Dan said, no one was hurt. But there was a hidden consequence to this that became much bigger over time. And that is that the crew's chief radio operator ended up having to go back to the US to his day job because of the time that it was taking to fix up the plane and to relaunch the mission. And that ended up having a huge impact.
So there were 3 main methods of navigation used at the time. First, there was dead reckoning, which is when you use your last known location, for example, your last fuel stop, and estimates for your current speed and the direction you're heading in to work out roughly where you currently are. The second would have been celestial navigation. The stars that you can see and their positions relative to each other depend on where you are and when you're looking. So if you can take measurements of the distances between stars and you know the date, you can look up in a table of all calculated star positions where that must mean that you're looking from. And the third most common was radio direction finder. So the Navy used a radio direction finder system where radio towers in fixed positions transmitted letters in Morse code. A pilot or a navigator could tell if they were traveling towards or away from a tower by whether the signal was getting stronger or weaker. And different towers transmitted different letters. So if you knew those, you could work out where you were and which direction you were traveling in.
The thing is, neither Amelia or her remaining crew member, Fred Noonan, were all that skilled at operating the radio equipment. They couldn't use that third method of navigation, so if they'd got blown off course, it would be much more difficult for them to find their way back.
Now that shouldn't have been a huge issue. After all, you've still got the other 2 methods to find your way, and so for that reason, Amelia and Fred weren't too worried about it. They prepared to start over again. They decided that they'd go back to the US, and this time they were going to leave from the East Coast, and they were going to travel in the opposite direction so that the Pacific crossing was their last big flight. Isabel picks up the story.
They crossed part of South America, and then they crossed the ocean, arrived to Africa and India, and then they arrived to New Guinea like a few months later. And at this point, there was almost like most part of their trip was completed. There were only 7,000 miles left, and that meant crossing the Pacific Ocean. And they were trying to reach Howland Island, which is a place in the middle of the ocean, a tiny islander, when Amelia reported that the gas was running low. And soon after that all communications from the plane stopped. And that was the end of the story.
Actually, the mystery has only just begun. Where did Amelia Earhart end up? What happened to her? And what went wrong?
I think the easiest bit to answer is that last question. What went wrong? We already know that Amelia and Fred were at a disadvantage in terms of finding their way because they weren't experts on the radio. But this lack of radio knowledge affected them in other ways too.
So in around 1930, airborne radios became reliable and powerful enough for use on planes. So pilots could use radio to communicate either with the ground, with anybody that they wanted to. The problem with that is that the range was relatively short. If you didn't have great communications capabilities, you might have pre-arranged to make a stop somewhere, but if they're out of communications range with you, there's not a great deal you can do to get in contact with them.
In other words, Amelia and Fred had to be really close to their destination, in this case Howland Island, and a nearby US ship that had communication devices on board in order to make contact. And though a few radio messages did come through from the plane before it just vanished, the crew on board the ship weren't able to guide them in the right direction or even have a proper conversation about what was going on board that mysterious flight.
There was like a massive rescue attempt. Like even the United States Navy sent all their navals and Coast Guard units to coordinate search efforts. But really the only thing they had were those last words in the radio signal from her. And that's what she said. She said that she was running out of fuel. Still, since everything was so mysterious, there were many theories around what happened with Amelia.
The tragic end to Amelia's flight around the world is just that. It is a tragedy. But not everyone believes that her plane crashed, or that even if it did, that she died as a result.
Okay, let's pull out a map. You can follow along on an atlas or on Google Maps. Ready? Okay. We're going to start out at a place called Lae. That's L-A-E. I think I've got the pronunciation right there. And it's in Papua New Guinea. That's where Amelia and Fred took off from on their journey to Howland Island. Now, if you zoom out a little bit more, we want to see all of Papua New Guinea. Well, when Amelia took off from Lae, she flew east-northeast, so that's up a bit and over to the right. And what do you see out there? Yeah, a whole load of ocean.
See if you can find Howland Island on Google Maps or whatever you're using right now. You'll probably find it quite difficult because it's really hard to find unless you type it in and search for it. The island is really small. It's just 2.6 square kilometers in total, and it sits by itself in the middle of the Pacific. It's this tiny dot in a literal sea of blue. It'd be really easy to miss if you're not keeping a close eye on your surroundings. And of course, if you were to be accidentally blown off course as you're flying there, you might not even realize that you're heading further away from it and right out across the ocean.
Remember earlier when Heather was talking about how far planes could travel in one go back in those days? Well, this leg of Amelia's trip, the one that went from Lae to Howland, was the longest leg that they'd done in the whole journey, and it was pretty close to the maximum distance that the Lockheed plane that they were flying could travel. So, like, in other words, there's literally zero margin of error. So if Amelia recognised that they were lost and they weren't going to make it to Howland as they planned, she'd have to come up with a solution really quickly.
If you're still on your map, take a look in the waters around Howland Island. You'll notice that there isn't much, but there are some other islands dotted here and there. So Amelia might have made the decision to fly somewhere else, or she might have happened to come across a bit of land that she thought she could safely get the plane onto. The most likely option is widely considered to be Gardner Island, given its location and the fact that it would probably have been in range for Amelia's plane. In fact, when US Navy planes visited the island in search for Amelia, they did find signs of recent human activity there. However, when they got onto the island and they carried out further searches, they couldn't find any proof or conclusive proof that Amelia or Fred had made it to the island.
Okay, so yeah, the mystery deepens, and the Gardner Island theory has kind of stuck around because, well, mostly because a skull was found there in 1940, and some studies suggest that this skull is a female skull, Could this be Amelia Earhart's skull? There are an equal number of studies on the other side that suggest it's a male skull. And there's really no other evidence of Fred or Amelia's survival on that island.
There are lots of theories around this. So, Dan, shall we just go through some of the main ones?
Yeah, cool. How about the one that Amelia and Fred were captured by Japanese forces after getting lost?
Yeah, this is a big one, and it is possible, although all the evidence that has cropped up over the years has been quite heavily disputed. So, for example, in 1966, a journalist suggested that the pair of them had been caught on the island of Saipan, but that would have been out of their reach on the Lockheed plane. And besides, at the time, the Japanese army would have been better off rescuing these two brave explorers than harming them, because while Japan and the US did become enemies during the Second World War that followed in the 1940s, they were at peace during the time of Amelia's flight, so there would have been no reason not to help out. Okay, Dan, what about this one? The idea that Amelia and Fred turned back to Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, this is another common suggestion. Basically, I guess that they thought they wouldn't make it. Amelia turned the airplane round and they tried to reach an airfield in northeastern Papua New Guinea, which would be about 2,200 miles from Howland. It would be just about possible, but it's a very long way to travel. Again, right at the limit of what this Lockheed aircraft was capable of. There was a report of some wreckage in the jungle about 40 miles from the airfield in 1945, and for a while people thought that it could have been Amelia's plane, but again, nobody's ever found it. Okay, one last theory, that Amelia survived and lived undercover for the rest of her life. What do you think about that one, Kieran?
It is truly strange, and it is as strange as any possible theory that you could come up with about what might have happened to Amelia Earhart. It first surfaced, I think, in a 2006 documentary, and the idea is that not only did Amelia and presumably Fred survive the flight, but she decided not to tell anyone. She moved to the US state of New Jersey. She changed her name to Irene Craigmill Bolam and lived out the rest of her days as a banker. Now, this is strange for all sorts of reasons, mainly that it doesn't make any sense, and it is a nonsense.
I love it. Well, yes, all these theories share one crucial thing in common: a complete lack of evidence. We've yet to find any proof of where Amelia and Fred ended up.
I guess we will never know for sure what happened to her, but it's something that I don't really talk to in my biographies, because otherwise they were all dead with a very sad ending. Everybody dies at some point in their lives, so I don't really talk about that part. I just leave it up to their imaginations, to what happened. She just disappeared, but we don't know. I never said, or I never wrote that she died, because we don't even know. Maybe she is alive somewhere in a tiny island.
Amelia and Fred knew that their journey was risky. They had already had that accident in their first attempt. But they did it anyway, and they persevered with their journey. They knew that they might not make it to the end, but still they started.
And this is what I found with writing my books as well, that all these incredible journeys that the women went on in my book were all about going out into the unknown. That's what a pioneer does. It's about stretching the boundaries of what we know is possible and going beyond them. And so if you are being a pioneer, and just the nature of it, you just don't know whether you're going to be successful or not. It is a life or death adventure. And you're willing to do that as a pioneer, as an explorer, because you have this thirst for adventure and knowledge, and you want to push those boundaries. And once you've done that, it makes it so much easier for other people then to follow, because they know it is possible.
This is what's kept Amelia's legacy alive all these years. She was a true pioneer of the skies, a real hero, and she overcame so many obstacles as well.
For any woman, being a woman in itself means having a pebble inside your shoe. So And sometimes this pebble is very small and it doesn't really affect that much your life, just hurt sometimes. But sometimes this pebble is huge, and so we have to recognize when a woman who, at a time when a woman had no freedom to do anything, she was ready to explore the world all by herself. I think that is really, really inspiring.
Whatever the ending to Amelia's story might be, whether it's a crash into the ocean, a detour to a nearby island, or something entirely different that we haven't thought of yet, her impact on aviation is undeniable. She set so many records during her lifetime as a pilot, and she has inspired countless people from future generations to chase their dreams and to do the undoable. Sure, her disappearance is a mystery of science. Amelia is a hero of science too, and of that, there's no question.
There you have it. This is a huge mystery. We've told you what we know about it, but I think it's time for you to have your say. What do you think happened to Amelia Earhart? Did she end up on Gardner Island? Or did she end up somewhere else completely? Did she return to Papua New Guinea? Will we ever know what happened to her? And crucially, should we keep looking?
We'll include some of those emails in a future episode of Mysteries of Science, so make sure you get involved. And remember, you can pick up the latest copy of the Week Junior's Science+Nature for even more Mysteries of Science.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next mystery. This one takes us into the world of medicine and the unexplainable power of the placebo effect. How can taking a fake pill make you think you're feeling better? And why does it still work even when you know that the pill is fake? This one's gonna melt your mind. Until then, stay curious.